Leading up to Christmas, I always end up making a number of Coptic sewing books. This is a little notebook that I made for one of my sons, and he's used it as a sketching pad. The Coptic sewing journal or notepad or sketch pad is a very popular project. It's relatively straightforward. The materials and equipment needed is limited. There's no adhesive on the spine. It's just generally a good, simple project that can be finished in an evening or an afternoon. Choose a paper that suits the purpose that the book will be used for. So if it's going to be a drawing pad, then you'll use drawing paper. Some sort of heavy card or grey board for the covers. This is a bit of craft paper that I'm going to line the inside of the covers. A piece of manila card, which I'm going to use for a jig, some thread to sew the book together, and a decorative paper to cover the book in. In this project, I'm going to do 5-sheet sections or gatherings. So start by folding 5 pieces of paper. Now in a Coptic sewing book, you want minimal swell at the spine. And the swell is how much thicker the spine is than the foredge. And this is determined by the thickness of the thread and the amount of paper to thread. So to minimize swell, you want more paper and thinner thread. Now I've seen a lot of videos that fold the paper and then put them together in a section like that. That's way too slow and far too tedious to do. I always just count out 5 sheets and fold them together. However, there is a reason that people do fold the sheets separately, and that's to get a nice even foredge. I deal with that by, when I jog the pages together, I push the ones further away from me slightly to the left, about a millimetre, and then when I fold them over, they end up quite even. I'll discuss swell and the trade-offs in paper and thread thickness later during the tedious sewing section. Now that I've folded all the paper, I'm going to cut the cover boards to size. Because these books aren't rounded and backed, there's nothing to stop the text block falling forward in the covers. So I'm not going to put a square, the extension of the boards past the text block, at the head and tail of the book. I'm going to make the covers, the boards, the same height as the text block. I started by straightening the one long edge on each piece of board and then squaring up a corner, and then I'll measure the length of the text block, which I think was, because it's A5, it was 210 millimeters. So I'll measure that, so that's the height of the book. And then the width of the book is 150 millimeters, but I wanted to extend about 3 millimeters, so I'm going to do 153 millimeters. So once I've cut one board, I'm going to use that board to measure out the other. Now, I was using a piece of wood to use my set square against. A handy tool, especially if you're working on the kitchen table a lot, is a little bench hook like this. Now, bookbinding generally has a rule that the grain of the material should run head to tail. If you don't know about the property of grain in paper or card, then I do have a video that explains it. Now, I'll reluctantly say that the paper in a Coptic sewing book, the grain direction isn't super important. However, in the boards it is important because we're going to adhere paper to it. So this board has a grain direction vertical, head to tail. And the paper I'm going to use to cover the board also has a vertical grain direction. Getting the grain direction wrong on the covers can result in the covers warping in a very undesirable way. So it's just easier to get it right. We've got a couple of tools, and that's a brush and adhesive. Now the adhesive I'm going to use is PVA. PVA has some advantages in that it doesn't introduce a lot of moisture and it sets or dries very quickly, so we can do the project quickly. However, it does set really quickly, so once you attach things you can't really pull them apart again if you've made a mistake. So you just have to be a little bit careful when you're laying things down that you get them in the right spot. By applying the adhesive to the boards instead of the paper, it will minimize the outward pull on the covers. And then the inside lining paper, I'll put the adhesive onto the paper, and so there'll be slightly more pull inwards than outwards. And the covers, if they do warp, will warp in or slightly hug the book, which is more desirable than having the covers warping outwards. Another tool I forgot about is this little 15mm gauge. I just made it by cutting a 15mm wide strip of grey board, and when it's covered in too much glue and I've cut into it too many times, I just make a new one. I use that to trim up the turn-ins. I'll do a very traditional corner used in bookbinding for cloth and paper, where you trim it 45 degrees about 3mm away from the corner of the book. The 3mm is actually 1.5 times the board thickness. The board I'm using is 2mm, so I trim 3mm away from the corner. Now bookbinders always turn in the head and the tail before the foredge. Now it's very much traditional, but there's also a reason for it. That little piece of overlapping paper will result in a small bump. And you want that bump to not be at the tail where it's going to drag along the bookshelf when you take the book in and out. You want that little bump to be at the foredge. Use a bone folder to turn up the paper so you get a nice sharp crisp turn over the edge, and then use your fingernail or the bone folder to push down that little piece of paper. Not too hard, you don't want to tear it, you just want to push it down. Now let's say it's coming up to Christmas and you're behind schedule on making presents. You might want to start putting adhesive on all 4 sides and then turning them in. It speeds the process up. Now if you have put adhesive on all 4 edges at the same time, you will have to go back and put a little bit of adhesive on that little tab of paper. Usually there's a bit of squeeze out and you can just use your finger to pick that up and put it on there. I was a little bit too neat, unfortunately, and so I had to use my brush. Using this approach, you'll end up with some really nice neat corners completely covered in the paper. The next step is to do the inside linings. I'm going to leave 4mm margins. Now it is important that the grain direction go head to tail on the lining paper, otherwise you may end up with boards that warp head to tail, which would not be very good. So why do I describe this as a journal rather than, say, a blank notebook? Well, the name journal is just simply much more evocative, and someone's much more likely to watch a 40-minute video of making a journal than making a book of blank paper. You're going to notice that the paper is going to curl up, and that's because of the moisture that I'm introducing into one side of the paper. Now, because of the grain direction, it's going to curl from foredge to spine, so I'm going to stretch it out and attach at the one end first. I'm going to judge the 4mm margin at the top and either side, and then lay it down. When smoothing out wet paper, it's a good idea to do it under rubbing down paper, which is just baking paper, silicone coated paper. Just means you can put more pressure on it and reduce the likelihood of tearing the paper. Now I'm going to punch holes in the covers and each of the signatures. And to do that, I'm going to make a little jig out of card. I'm going to make a little hook along the edge of this stiff card, which is manila card. I'll hook it on one end of the book and then mark the other end. I want 5 sewing locations. 2 of them are 20mm in from each end, 1 is in the center, and then the other 2 are halfway between the end ones and the center one. I want a row of holes 10mm in, or 1/2 inch, from the edge of the book. So I'll get that template 10mm in, and at each of the locations I'll prick a mark with an awl. And then I'll put the board on the edge of the bench and then push those holes through. I need to keep track of which end I'm measuring from. I always have to measure from the same end. For the rear cover, the marks are on the wrong side of the template, so I have to transfer them around. Now I'm going to use the template to punch the holes in the center of the sections. I'll use a piece of corrugated cardboard to push the holes down through the sections. I'll just push the awl in at 45 degrees into the center of the fold. Once you've made this little template, you can use it for future books. You don't have to make up a new one. You can just fold the paper and go ahead and punch the holes. I've changed my mind on the thread I'm going to use. I'm going to use a slightly thinner thread to reduce the swell. This is a number 25 3-ply linen thread. I'm going to use a little trick that's common amongst bookbinders. It just stops the needle pulling off the end of the thread. I just pierce the thread with the needle and then pull that back over the needle onto the thread. To start sewing, start on the inside of the first section at the first hole, and then go to the outside of the board at the corresponding hole, and then bring the needle to the inside of the book, and then bring the thread to the left in the picture of the thread coming out of the section. So that's on the side of the direction we're sewing in. Now wrap that thread around the thread that comes from the section and pull that tight. Now go over that loop there, don't go through that loop. If you go through the loop, it's not the end of the world. It just means the text block will sit slightly further back inside the cover and the cover won't open quite as nicely. Once you get everything in location and pull it nice and tight, you put the needle back through the hole that you came out of, back into the inside of the section. And then I tie it off with a single hitch. Some people like to use a reef knot, but I find the knot too bulky and I think the single hitch is not going to come undone. Now you do this 4 more times. One of the keys to this sewing is to be consistent. So always the direction that you go in and out of the book, always do it the same way. So when the needle goes through the board, I always come out on the left when I'm sewing to the left and around the thread. And if I'm going in the other direction, then I'll go in at the right when I'm sewing towards the right. This will produce nice neat sewing and a nice chain link appearance across the spine. Let's get back to talking about swell. Swell is the extra thickness at the spine of a book caused by the sewing thread and also by the fold in the paper, but it's mostly the thread. So to decrease the swell, you can use more paper. So if you're using a thin paper, you use more sheets to the section. If you're using thicker paper, then you won't get as much swell for the same amount of paper. You can reduce the thickness of the thread, but in these exposed sewing books, you often want to make the sewing a feature, so you want to use a thicker thread to see the pattern in the link stitch. And if that's the case, then you have to adjust the paper to reduce the swell. The other thing you'll notice is as I'm sewing the book, I'll use my bone folder occasionally to flatten the spine of the book and push the thread into the paper. This also reduces the swell. Once you reach the end, then instead of going back inside the same section, you put on the second section and go on to the inside of that, go down to the second hole, and then back out. Oops, the thread just got caught on one of the knobs on the tripod leg. Now we're going to form the link stitch by putting the needle in between the board and the first section, and then back out around the thread, and then back inside the section and go down to the next hole. Keep everything in position and pulled tight as you're going along to get nice even tension on the sewing. At the end of the second section, put the needle around, and this will pull up to a nice little loop. Put the needle up through the loop and pull it tight, and then go into the third section. Now for all other sections, the chain link goes between the two sections below the one that you're adding. When pulling the thread tight, always pull in the direction of the spine, otherwise you're likely to rip the paper. When you run out of thread, you can either tie a reef knot or a double overhand knot, or if you want to get fancy, you can use a weaver's knot, which is common in bookbinding, and I have a video on that if you want to learn how to do a weaver's knot. Now, researching this video, I found there's a huge amount of variation in the YouTube videos in how Coptic sewing is done. There's been a fair bit of research into early bookbinding, and 1,000 years ago, when this link stitch unsupported sewing was common, there was a huge amount of variation in this sewing. So I've used the first example here, which I think is the most common and the easiest one to do. But just from that page, you could see there's a lot of variation in the way you can do these link stitches. So it's not surprising that there's still a lot of variation in the way this type of sewing is done, and then the way it's used in making a binding, in attaching the boards. So videos that show different ways aren't wrong, and it's just another way of doing this binding. And of course, people do this binding because they like to show their individuality and creativity, and that's one of the features of this type of binding. However, the approach I've shown is what I think is one of the simplest forms, so great for starting out, and it also produces a really nice, neat result. Attaching the last section and the back cover is probably the trickiest part. So I'm just going to push these holes, clear these holes so they're nice and open, and you just put the last section down without going into it, and then go from the outside of the board to the inside, put the thread to the right in this case because we're sewing to the right, go around the thread just like we did for the first cover, back out to the front. Now we're going to do a chain stitch. This is the 8th section, so the chain stitch is going to go between the 6th and the 7th section. Now's the trickiest step, and that is getting the needle through the hole in the last section. Just try and get that section to the spine of the book and get everything aligned. Try and find that hole and get the needle through it. Now just repeat this process 4 more times. No matter how many times I try and remind myself, I always end up putting my head in front of the camera occasionally. And to finish up, just do a half hitch and cut off the thread. So the decorative cover paper is a traditional paste paper done in the Herrnhuter style, and I learned about the Herrnhuters through the bookbinder Deborah Evetts. So good luck with your Coptic sewing book or journal. It's a fun little project and makes a great present.